Mike really is the brainchild behind what we've been doing all morning here, which is to look at this budget from every which way and every perspective. Mike's specialty at Fiscal Track is to strategically analyze the space budget. He comes with a great background to do that because he used to serve in Congress back in the 111th Congress as one of the members of the staff there working on budget issues. So he brings a great wealth of experience with him. And Mike, let me invite you forward and to come up and do this.
Thank you, Doug.
Sure.
Thank you all for coming out. This is my baby, and I put this together last year, kind of conceptualized it as a reason for us all to be in this room as stakeholders and advocates for the space budget, to really get into the nitty-gritty and to bore you for 30 minutes with details about what's actually in the budget. I'm one of the guys that actually opens the budget justifications, actually reads them, and finds out what's changing from year to year in the space budget. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give a kind of a macro overview of where the portfolio looks like historically over a 10-year trend. Where's the stratification in the budget? What are the programs and mission sets that are driving the budget? And then what's new this year? What's changing? I think we have the first one up. The budget that we are talking about here is the Fiscal Track MFP for space. That's to say, over the past couple legislative cycles, Congress and the department have worked to elevate the visibility of the space portfolio from a budget mechanics standpoint and a congressional authorization and appropriations standpoint. What that means is 2 years ago, they created a new account called Space Procurement Air Force. All the space programs had previously been funded in either other procurement or missile procurement in the Air Force budget. And they peeled out and created a new space procurement budget, and that was about 2 cycles ago. That was coincident with an effort to create this Major Force Program that we heard about earlier, Major Force Program 12. There are obviously 11 others. And the mechanics and the advantages that a Major Force Program brings is important. The reason Congress and I think the department are aligned in creating a Major Force Program for space is to create the visibility, traceability, and tracking from year to year to identify collectively, are we making the right investments in the space portfolio? The legitimate mechanics of how that works in the budget documentations that are delivered from the president to Congress this year involved changing program element numbers. So the prefixes of all of these programs switched from 060, which was the previous Major Force Program that these programs were funded in, into Major Force Program 12. Now, for a budget nerd like me, that causes great consternation because the way that they present this is they bifurcate those lines. So the new MFP 12 RDT&E line has no prior funding because it's a new program element. And the prior program element, the 060, terminates and has no future funding. So what we've gone and done is, using our Fiscal Track system, identify what I think collectively are about 120 program elements that do genuinely make up the bulk of the space budget. We're talking about unclassified only. We're talking about procurement and RDT&E only. These are the acquisition accounts. There is a large pot of money for satellite control operations in O&M. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the acquisition accounts. This list evolved from our event last year. Last year, when I did the analysis and worked with folks in the department to try and create a good list, it was about $6.7 billion. And this year, based on not just adding things, but the creation of the MFP identified through program element numbers some additional program elements that we hadn't been tracking. So the total that we have is $8.2 billion between procurement and RDT&E. And I would like to point out, when we did this event last year in FY17, the total amount was at actually the 10-year low. And we had some concerned Air Force people in the room when I was briefing that. It's just a reality of the 125 program elements that we have identified that at that point in time, they were at a historical low. Fortunately, if you look this year, the budget that Todd just described, the $54 billion increase, has trickled down to space in the space portfolio. And I will go on a mission-by-mission area basis to identify kind of where some of those increased investments were. And I think it's important also to note, when I say increased investment, I'm talking about what would have been in FY18 in the President Obama budget versus what's in the 18 budget from Trump. There's other comparisons that you can make. You could say, what's the budget for FY18 compared to what was enacted last year or what was requested last year? But for the purposes of this analysis that we'll do, we thought it was important to highlight what has changed. What did the department invest in more than they would have under the previous administration? I do also want to point out, to Todd's point, that we've been living under the shadow of sequester and BCA. The space portfolio is certainly not immune to it. In FY13, you can see the stark drop in funding, and we've been slowly but surely creeping our way back to pre-sequester levels. You all know better than I do that the space portfolio is driven by acquisitions of major systems that are cyclical in nature, and some of that is going to be a natural ebb and flow. But I think you can see, just based on the recent 5-year, the investment that they made in FY18 is substantial. Next slide, please. So again, this is a breakout between procurement and RDT&E. I will say that there is an overall increase in FY18 over last year's projected FY18 amount, but it's being driven by investment in RDT&E. It's not being driven by increased investment in procurement. In fact, procurement in this portfolio is down, predominantly because of a push to the right on one GPS article being acquired. So the increase that we're seeing is predominantly done through RDT&E and increased investment in the areas that I'll show you. This is predominantly Air Force, as you can imagine. 85% of this portfolio is in the Air Force, 9% is in the Army, and the remainder is separated through folks like Navy, DISA, MDA, etc. Next slide, please. So, second part of our analysis that doesn't have any real corollary in terms of what the department delivers to Congress when they deliver the budget is segmentation by market. We used some of the Air Force's segmentation from a mission set as the guideline, and you'll see what those are. Launch, missile warning, SATCOM, PNT, GPS. The big science and technology portfolio accounts that allow kind of broad, diffused investment. Space control, command and control systems, management, overhead, weather, and that SSA is actually consumed inside of space control. So this involves an exercise of going and reading every program element justification and trying to bin them into a single mission set. And we obviously know that that's not a precise science. There's obviously programs and platforms that cross these mission sets. But for the purposes of traceability and market analysis, we've basically binned each one of these program elements into one of these mission sets. And then we've actually further stratified that inside of space control. Is it space fence? Is it space situational awareness? Is it offensive or defensive counter space measures? So as you can see, the predominant drivers of the space budget are driven, I said this last year, by the major acquisition platforms. So launch, wideband SATCOM and protected SATCOM, GPS, and missile warning and SIBRs. Those are the main drivers, and that's reflected in the stratification that you see on the chart. Next slide, please. This is the FY18 look that allows you to see where the portfolio is spread across mission sets. And like I said, you have SATCOM, launch, missile warning, and PNT as the large drivers of the budget. Next slide. This one should be an adjustment. So the orange line is Obama's budget and the projection in the Future Years Defense Program that was contained in that 17 budget. And just for the space programs that we're talking about, the 125 program elements that we've identified. And the blue bar is the Trump administration's FY18 request and their associated Future Years Defense Program. So you can see that the space portfolio did get a bump, but it doesn't sustain that bump through the Future Years Defense Program. So that's something to be mindful of. And you'll see it more apparent in each one of the market looks. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go in on a mission-by-mission area basis to identify, what's the new things in the budget, what's the so what for each of these mission sets. In space control, this is one of the areas where there was additional investment over the prior year inside of the department, right? So this is not driven by Congress. This is inside of the administration's request. We saw some new activity. There's a new start, $10 million new start for a space surveillance telescope, essentially a terrestrial-based, as close to you can get, SSA capability. And then there were substantial increases to some of the other base kind of programs that are in this portfolio. SSA Ops got an increase of $77 million over what was projected in the Obama budget. And there's another $40 million for a new project to develop this Space Operations Development Center. to your discussion about Space Fence, Space Fence year over year dropped about 132 million, but that was expected. That was part of the program plan, and according to the justification documents and everything that we see, the program is kind of on pace and on schedule and on budget, and this downturn in the Space Fence funding reflects that as expected, not surprised. I'm not taking a bet. There's also increased investment for the JSPOC, and they have carved out what was the JICSPOC into its own program element and created the National Space Defense Center for that purpose. And these are all inside of the space control portfolio, some meaningful increases. Next one, and any question, and we should feel free to, if you want to interject on a particular mission set, I'm happy to take a question in the middle. Otherwise, we can move to the next one. Is command and control. So command and control systems, for the purposes of our analysis, these are things like the Air Force Satellite Control Network. It's the Air Operations Center. It's the Cheyenne Mountain Complex. It's JSPOC. And these are the command and control functions and the investments into them that are intended to integrate all these different capabilities, whether it's commercial, whether it's multiple systems. I will also say, you've heard, I think, of the move to have commonality and integrated ground systems. I think you heard the Secretary this morning say that if you do not have a system that's going to be interoperable with the future of the architecture, you're not going to win the bid. They have adjusted the way that they are investing in the Enterprise Ground Service. The Enterprise Ground Service is intended to be this common ground system to integrate all of the major platforms, and it will be what's built to. This is a very large endeavor, and it appeared in the budget last year for the first time, diffused across the major space platforms. So the Space Modernization Initiative for SBIRS, GPS, and AEHF had little wedges of investment to basically take those platforms and do some prototyping with those platforms to eventually develop a common ground system. This year, they altered that acquisition strategy and have created essentially a EGS line that integrates all of those separate funding streams into one program element as embodied in what is now the Space and Missile Test Evaluation Center program element. So that's a little bit of a different approach, and it'll increase the visibility. Next slide, please. Missile warning. Missile warning is obviously driven substantially by SBIRS. And you'll see here the end of in the FY11 range was basically the procurement of the final articles of the current suite of capability. And this budget, the FY18 budget, actually memorializes the future SBIRS program. It's called Evolve SBIRS. It does represent essentially an acquisition strategy that came out of the analysis of alternatives that was done in the previous years. This approach was not embodied in the FY17 request. FY17 request was kind of silent on what exactly the future system for SBIRS would look like. This one defines it. It peels out a new program element for the research, development, test, and evaluation of that future system, and really starts to bifurcate from a funding and program element and mechanics standpoint the existing program of record from the future program of record. This is somewhat of a general theme when it comes to these major platforms. 2 AOAs done over the past couple years have produced in this budget new acquisition strategies for those platforms. One is protected comms and one is SBIRS. So this is the outgrowth of an AOA, and that's what's driving that future investment that you see in the tail of this chart is the investment into that future architecture for the missile warning system. Next slide, please. SATCOM. I know there's a lot of SATCOM operators here, so this is something that's dear to your heart. The yellow line is the one that I would like to highlight first. That is WGS. You will see that WGS disappears from the budget, and that's in the current FY18 request. Coming in about FY19, I believe, there's no more money for the wideband mission in either procurement or RDT&E. There's an ongoing analysis of alternatives on the wideband mission that would presumably have the same outgrowth that we saw with SBIRS and that we'll see with protected comms. that will produce a future budget wedge for that future wideband system. That is the TBD right now, just like SBIRS was last year and AEHF and Protected Comms was last year. We don't know what's the investment strategy on the wideband mission yet. Somewhere buried in here is narrowband. And to answer Warren's question, the investments into MUOS right now are entirely devoted to aligning the terminal system. They are not even thinking from the budget perspective about investing in that future architecture until they get the current architecture's terminal side correct. So all of the investments in the fleet SATCOM follow-on lines in the Navy budget are directly related to terminal investment, not space segment or even architecting what that future system looks like. Protected Comms is also reflected in this budget and reflects an entirely new, I say entirely new, but reflects a commitment and decision by the Department and the Air Force on an acquisition strategy for the future of that mission. So in the budget, what was previously kind of contained in the existing AEHF lines, which is the program of record for Protected Comms, has now been bifurcated out in several ways into a basically protected tactical enterprise service cadre of program elements that are designed to be the investment vehicles for that future system. That is also the outgrowth of an AOA that produced an investment strategy that is embodied in this budget. Like I said, we should expect the same thing to evolve on the wideband mission, depending on how quickly that wideband AOA is completed. We may see that as early as FY19. Next slide. GPS, sorry, PNT, which is largely driven by GPS. The big story here in the 18 budget is a push to the right of the acquisition of the last article and a push to the right in terms of the recompete on the follow-on system. So that's a change that drove a little bit of a drag in the budget to the right. And as I said, that decreased funding, which was substantial in the $500 million range, has been kind of consumed overall by the increased investment in RDT&E. Next slide, please. Weather. This is something, a mission that obviously has a little bit of a checkered history, I think you're all aware of, and especially related to congressional engagement on this mission. You'll see in the front of the chart, DMSP kind of ending from an acquisition and investment standpoint. And the future program of record for the weather mission is Weather System Follow-On, and that's embodied in a program element. The architecture and design of that system is not defined yet in the budget justifications in any way. It's a FY22 capability, and that's really going to be the future of the weather mission. But in the interim, the department has been dealing with congressional oversight relative to gaps that exist in the existing weather requirements and have been trying to work with Congress to find the appropriate way to fill those gaps. This budget in 18 represents a very earnest effort to close those gaps and to mitigate the concern that Congress has over gaps 1 and 2, theater weather imagery and cloud characterization, which has been a bee in HASC's bonnet for quite some time now. So what are they doing? They are investing in a new program element called EOIR Weather System. This is a brand new start. It's something that they have to get to a milestone A decision by a certain date in order to forestall a requirement to create a plan to transfer that mission to the NRO. There's a law in the books that says if you don't do that by a certain date, you must create a plan to transfer the budget and program to the NRO. So the Air Force has committed to fulfilling this weather mission and has created this EOIR weather program as essentially a gap filler to a gap filler to bridge that gap on gap 1 and 2. That is not the only way that the Air Force is addressing the weather gap. They are also investing substantially in the ORS, Operationally Responsive Space program element, at levels that this budget line has not seen since ORS 1 was launched. And it's for the weather mission. It's entirely to, not entirely, it's of a $90 million line, about $80 million of it is being dedicated to help fill this weather gap with ORS 8. And then that's not it. They put money in the Space Mods account, program element, in order to help acquire a ground station to help plug gaps in this 1 and 2 as well. So if Steve Katay were still in the job and up here, he probably would say that this is what he had been looking for a while. And I think this probably is earnestly enough to retain the mission and get the Air Force back on the path to fulfilling those gapped requirements. Next slide, please. Science and technology. So this is where, these are these large accounts that allow flexibility in investment strategy and flexibility in, they're not dedicated to a single mission, they're not dedicated to a single program element, and it allows that kind of flexibility for investment. It's things like space technology in the Air Force, space application advanced technology in the Army, DARPA has a line. And you can see that this is one of the mechanisms that the department is trying to leverage to increase the investment in the portfolio. So you'll see that in FY18, all of these lines got pretty substantial increases from an overall kind of R&D, science and technology standpoint. This is not something where as an industry contractor you can go in and peg it as a specific mission area or platform, but there are areas of investment and increased investment here over projected levels that are worth pursuing. Next slide, please. Launch. Obviously, this large blue bar, it represents EELV, which is the large driver of the launch account. But there are some launch support services in there as well. And this budget in 18 pretty much retains the trajectory of the EELV program from an acquisition and launch services standpoint. There's nothing substantially different. And what's also important here to discuss is the Air Force's investment strategy in the next generation launch system and the back and forth that Congress has had with them about the way to invest in that future launch capability. The most basic recap is Congress is more focused on the propulsion system and alleviating the dependence on the RD-180 engine. Whereas the Air Force and the Department view that as a necessary step to a larger goal of getting a new launch system and service. The budget retains the DoD and Air Force's existing strategy that was ultimately authorized and appropriated in last year's bill, which is to have flexibility in where they invest those funds. Congress wants them investing predominantly and almost entirely in the RD-180 replacement rocket propulsion system. This budget and last year's omnibus and NDAA do provide the department with a little bit of flexibility within congressionally dictated bounds to invest in upper stage as well as main stage propulsion development. That's something that we have heard differing viewpoints on whether or not that's going to stick or whether that will be a fight again in Congress this year. Frankly, Chairman Rogers is the one that was really driving that train last year. And he's obviously more focused this year on space reorganization and management. And we saw how it ended last year, so it remains to be seen whether or not this is going to be a fight again this year in committee and in Congress. But I think the ultimate end game is this continued flexibility for investment in both the upper and the main stage. Next slide, please. There are a couple of management lines that embody the SMC civilian workforce. And those are, as you can see, newly created in law and budget mechanics in the early part of this decade, and has certainly kind of increased with, essentially cost of growth, no substantial spikes or valleys in that investment portfolio. I think that might be it. We might have one more. Nope. So that's the big picture on the space budget. We will provide you these slides and this analysis so you can kind of get into the weeds with me if you want to about what's in this portfolio, what's not, what's in a mission area, what's not, and on an individual program basis you can see where these adjustments have been.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Mike. Okay, we have about 7 minutes to go ahead and get in the weeds, and Jamie, I think you get first dibs.
You give me cape?
So Todd Harrison went way out on a limb and predicted a continuing resolution to start the year here. We are, and I think the fiscal crunch that he described also puts us at a higher risk of even a full year continuing resolution than we've seen in recent years. As you look at the details of the portfolio, what program areas do you think would be most impacted by a long or, God forbid, full year continuing resolution?
So the short answer to that is all of the new starts, right? So there are a lot of new starts in the space portfolio in this budget. I think, when General Teague briefed it by the Air Force, he had highlighted about 6 or 7 new starts that, whether it's the EO/IR weather mission, whether it's, technically creation of the National Space Defense Center as a standalone program element. These are the types of things that under continuing resolutions are prohibited by law to be created, started, initiated. And obviously that is a very large detriment to the creation and initiation of these new programs. The other thing I would highlight based on your question is that in my research, it did seem like space control and the increased investments compared to what would have been projected under the Obama budget, those are most susceptible to the challenge that Todd highlighted relative to the gap between where the congressional intent is and what they can actually get. All of those increases are potential. If they have to lower the president's budget request, those are potential pay-fors in the portfolio.
Okay, other questions? There you go, right here.
Hey, Wilson Brissett, Air Force Magazine. I'm wondering about NRO's space spending. I'm guessing that's not captured in any of
That's correct.
the slides here, and I'm especially interested in NRO launch. Is there visibility into how much is spent on that and how it compares to?
There's not. I mean, to be clear, what I'm doing here with this data is just all publicly available. It's what came out when the president released the budget on the DoD Comptroller's website. It's all unclassified. Now, the unclassified budget makes reference to classified programs, and there are program lines that have numbers that are an aggregate of all of the classified investment, but there's absolutely no visibility in the public domain in terms of how much one intelligence agency is getting versus another, and even inside of that where those investments are. There is a requirement by law that they release the MIP and the NIP top line funding, and it's done, I think, retroactively in terms of this is what the top line was last year versus prospectively. I might have that wrong, but that's the maximum kind of insight that is required by law and is generally limited to that.
Anybody else? Questions? Okay.
Well, before we break for lunch, this is an event I'm very proud of, and it doesn't go off without a lot of other people being involved. So I did want to thank my team that has been walking around the room today: Steve, Peter, Kathleen Ryan, Captain Anicelli, all the staff that helped put me in position to get the speakers that we had today, the congressional staff that have attended, and all of you for taking the time to join us today. So thank you very much.